The macabre history of the Lowells. A secret millionaire woman adopted 13 kids without names in the autumn of 1974, when America was emerging from the shadows of Watergate and the Vietnam War. The prestigious town of Beacon Hill, Massachusetts, was shaken by whispers of an extraordinary event that would challenge everything the community thought it knew about one of its most prominent families. The Lowell Mansion, a 4-story federal-style townhouse that had stood as a monument to New England aristocracy for over 2 centuries, suddenly became home to 13 children who possessed no names, no histories, and no official existence. In any government record, Constance Lowell, the 62-year-old widow who had orchestrated this mysterious adoption, was a figure who commanded both respect and unease in Boston's elite social circles. As the last surviving member of one of America's oldest and wealthiest families, she controlled a fortune estimated at over $50 million, along with vast holdings in real estate, manufacturing, and financial institutions that had been accumulated over generations of careful investment and ruthless business practices. The Lowell family legacy stretched back to the earliest days of European settlement in New England, with ancestors who had been instrumental in establishing the Massachusetts Bay Colony and building the industrial empire that would make Boston one of America's most important commercial centers. The family had survived wars, economic depressions, and social upheavals that had destroyed lesser dynasties, always adapting and evolving to maintain their position at the pinnacle of American society. Constance herself was a woman whose beauty had been legendary in her youth but had acquired an otherworldly quality as she aged. Her silver hair was always perfectly arranged, her clothing was tailored by the finest designers in Paris and London, and her bearing reflected the confidence that came from generations of inherited privilege. However, there was something in her pale green eyes that suggested depths of knowledge and experience that made even her closest associates uncomfortable. The Lowell Mansion on Beacon Hill had been the family's primary residence since 1847, when Constance's great-grandfather had purchased the property and extensively renovated it to reflect the family's growing wealth and social prominence. The house contained 43 rooms spread across 4 floors, each decorated with priceless antiques, original artwork by masters like Sargent and Whistler, and furnishings that represented the finest craftsmanship of their respective eras. Mansion's most distinctive feature was its library, which occupied the entire 2nd floor and contained over 15,000 volumes, covering subjects that ranged from classical literature and philosophy to obscure texts on psychology, anthropology, and what could only be described as occult studies. Constance had inherited not only her family's wealth, but also their intellectual curiosity and their fascination with esoteric knowledge that existed on the margins of conventional academic study. The 13 children who arrived at the Lowell Mansion during the first weeks of October 1974 ranged in age from 5 to 15 years old. What made their presence so disturbing was not their number, but the complete absence of any identifying information about their origins, backgrounds, or even their names. They had been delivered to the mansion in the middle of the night by individuals whose identities remained unknown, and their arrival had been conducted with such secrecy that even the household staff had been unaware of what was happening until the next morning. The children's appearance suggested that they had come from various ethnic and geographical backgrounds, representing a deliberate diversity that seemed inconsistent with random selection. Some possessed the fair complexions and light eyes common in Northern European populations, while others displayed features suggesting African, Asian, or Latin American heritage. Their ages and physical development indicated that they had been well cared for prior to their arrival, but their psychological state revealed trauma that went far beyond simple displacement from familiar surroundings. What shocked the household staff most profoundly was the children's complete inability or unwillingness to communicate their identities. They would not respond to any names, showed no recognition when presented with common first names from various cultures, and seemed genuinely confused when asked about their families, homes, or previous lives. It was as if their personal histories had been completely erased, leaving only the physical shells of children who had once possessed distinct identities and relationships. Dr. Margaret Thornton, the family physician who had served the Lowells for over 30 years, was called to examine the children shortly after their arrival. Her medical assessment revealed that while they were physically healthy and showed no signs of abuse or malnutrition, their psychological condition was deeply troubling. The children displayed symptoms consistent with severe dissociative disorders, as if their minds had been systematically stripped of personal memories and identifying information. The children's behavior patterns suggested that they had been subjected to sophisticated psychological conditioning designed to eliminate their sense of individual identity while maintaining their basic cognitive and social functions. They could speak, read, and perform age-appropriate tasks, but they showed no curiosity about their past lives and seemed genuinely unable to recall anything about their existence prior to arriving at the mansion. Constance Lowell's explanation for the children's presence was both elaborate and unconvincing. She claimed that they were the survivors of a tragic accident that had occurred at an experimental boarding school in Europe, where they had been participating in an innovative educational program designed to develop exceptional intellectual and creative abilities. The trauma of the accident had allegedly caused the complete memory loss that explained their inability to recall their identities or backgrounds. The legal arrangements surrounding the children's adoption had been handled with such discretion and speed that even experienced attorneys found them difficult to understand or verify. Constance had apparently worked with legal representatives in several countries to establish guardianship over the children, using her vast financial resources to overcome bureaucratic obstacles and expedite processes that would normally take months or years to complete. The household staff at the Lowell mansion found themselves responsible for caring for 13 children, whose needs and personalities were completely unknown to them. The children were assigned temporary names based on alphabetical order and their apparent ages, but these designations seemed to have no meaning for the children themselves, who responded to them only after extensive repetition and conditioning. Children's daily routines were established by Constance, according to principles that seemed to draw from various educational philosophies and psychological theories. They were divided into age-appropriate groups for instruction in traditional academic subjects, but their education also included extensive training in what Constance termed memory reconstruction and identity development. These sessions involved hypnosis, meditation, and other techniques that were supposed to help the children recover their lost memories and rebuild their sense of self. The children's living quarters had been prepared in advance of their arrival, suggesting that Constance had been planning their adoption for considerable time. Each child was provided with a private bedroom, furnished with expensive furniture and decorated with artwork and books, selected to stimulate intellectual and aesthetic development. However, the rooms lacked the personal touches and familiar objects that would normally help children feel secure in new surroundings. The isolation imposed on the children was as complete as it was subtle. They were not enrolled in local schools, did not receive visits from social workers or other officials, and had no contact with children or adults outside the mansion. Their world consisted entirely of the house, its grounds, and the small group of staff members who had been carefully selected for their discretion and their willingness to follow Constance's unusual instructions without question. The children's education was provided by a series of private tutors who were brought to the mansion on carefully scheduled visits. These educators were never allowed to learn the children's supposed names or backgrounds, and they were instructed to focus on specific subject areas without attempting to develop personal relationships with their students. The compartmentalization of the children's educational experience ensured that no outside person could gain comprehensive knowledge of their situation. As weeks turned to months, the children began to develop new personalities and identities based on their experiences at the mansion. However, these emerging selves seemed artificial and constructed, lacking the organic development that characterizes normal childhood psychological growth. The children became increasingly dependent on Constance and the structured environment she had created, showing signs of anxiety and distress when routines were disrupted, or when they were separated from the controlled atmosphere of the mansion. The household staff began to notice disturbing changes in the children's behavior as they adapted to their new circumstances. They displayed an unusual uniformity in their responses to situations, as if they were following invisible scripts rather than reacting spontaneously to events. Their interactions with each other seemed carefully orchestrated, and they showed little of the natural curiosity, rebellion, or individuality that would be expected from children of their ages. Dr. Thornton's follow-up examinations revealed that the children's memory problems were not improving, despite the intensive therapeutic interventions that Constance had implemented. If anything, their dissociative symptoms seemed to be intensifying, as if the techniques being used to help them recover their identities were actually reinforcing their psychological fragmentation. The children's artistic and creative expressions, which Constance encouraged as part of their therapeutic development, began to reveal patterns that suggested their lost memories were not entirely gone, but were being suppressed by psychological barriers that prevented conscious access. Their drawings, stories, and musical compositions contained recurring themes and symbols that seemed to reference shared experiences or trauma that they could not consciously recall. The mystery surrounding the children's origins deepened as Constance's explanations for their presence became increasingly elaborate and contradictory. She would sometimes claim that they were the children of close friends who had died in tragic circumstances, other times suggesting that they were victims of political persecution who required protection from dangerous enemies. Her inconsistent stories only served to heighten the suspicions of those who worked in the mansion and observed the children's unusual circumstances. By the spring of 1975, the Lowell mansion had become a closed world where 13 children with no names or histories were being transformed into something that bore little resemblance to normal human development. The wealth and social position that had always protected the Lowell family from scrutiny were being used to conceal an experiment in human psychology that challenged fundamental assumptions about identity, memory, and the nature of childhood itself. The stage was set for discoveries that would expose the true purpose behind Constance Lowell's mysterious adoption and reveal the disturbing methods she had used to acquire 13 children whose identities had been systematically erased. The secrets hidden within the mansion's elegant rooms would soon surface, bringing with them revelations about the lengths to which wealth and power could be used to manipulate and control the most vulnerable members of society. The truth about the 13 nameless children began to emerge in the winter of 1976, when a former household employee named Sarah McKinnon contacted federal authorities with disturbing allegations about the activities taking place within the Lowell mansion. McKinnon, who had worked as a housekeeper for the family for 18 months before being dismissed for asking too many questions about the children's welfare, possessed detailed knowledge of the daily routines and unusual practices that Constance Lowell had implemented in her quest to transform the 13 children into something unprecedented in human experience. McKinnon's testimony revealed that the children's memory loss had not been the result of trauma, as Constance had claimed, but rather the product of systematic psychological conditioning designed to erase their previous identities and prepare them for complete reconstruction according to Constance's specifications. The process had been implemented using techniques that combined cutting-edge psychological research with methods that bordered on torture, all conducted under the guise of therapeutic treatment and educational advancement. The investigation that followed McKinnon's revelations was led by FBI Special Agent Patricia Hoffman, a specialist in cases involving child exploitation and psychological abuse. Agent Hoffman's examination of the Lowell mansion revealed a sophisticated facility for psychological experimentation that had been disguised as a luxurious family residence. Hidden within the mansion's elegant rooms were monitoring systems, therapeutic equipment, and documentation that revealed the scope and nature of Constance's activities. The mansion's basement had been converted into what could only be described as a laboratory for psychological research, complete with observation rooms, recording equipment, and medical facilities that were far more advanced than anything available in conventional therapeutic settings. The children had been subjected to daily sessions in these hidden chambers, where they underwent procedures designed to systematically destroy their existing memories and replace them with carefully constructed artificial personalities. Agent Hoffman's investigation revealed that Constance Lowell had been working with a network of rogue psychologists and medical researchers who had been conducting illegal experiments in memory manipulation and identity reconstruction. These individuals had been attracted to Constance's project by the opportunity to test theories about human consciousness and personality development that could never be explored through legitimate research channels. The children had been acquired through a complex network of criminal organizations that specialized in human trafficking, child exploitation, and the falsification of legal documents. Each child had been selected according to specific criteria that related to their psychological profiles, physical characteristics, and family situations. They had been chosen from populations where their disappearance would not trigger intensive searches or draw unwanted attention from law enforcement. The process of erasing the children's identities had been conducted in stages over several months prior to their arrival at the Lowell mansion. They had been held at a facility in rural New Hampshire, where they had been subjected to combinations of psychological conditioning, pharmaceutical interventions, and what could only be described as brainwashing designed to destroy their connection to their previous lives. The documentation discovered in the mansion revealed that Constance's ultimate goal had been to create a group of individuals who could serve as perfect inheritors of the Lowell family legacy. Having no children of her own and facing the extinction of her family line, she had decided to manufacture heirs who would carry forward the family name and fortune, while possessing no competing loyalties or conflicting memories that might interfere with their dedication to the Lowell legacy. That the 13 children had been selected to represent different aspects of the ideal Lowell heir that Constance envisioned. Some had been chosen for their intellectual potential, others for their artistic abilities, and still others for their physical characteristics or psychological profiles. Once their original identities had been erased, they were to be rebuilt according to carefully designed specifications that would make them perfect embodiments of Lowell family values and traditions. The psychological conditioning that the children had undergone was far more sophisticated and dangerous than conventional brainwashing techniques. The researchers working with Constance had developed methods for selectively destroying specific types of memories while preserving basic cognitive functions and learned skills. The children retained their ability to speak, read, and perform complex tasks, but they had lost all connection to their personal histories and emotional attachments. The process had also involved the implantation of false memories designed to provide the children with artificial backgrounds that supported their new roles as Lowell family members. These fabricated histories were carefully constructed to eliminate any desire to search for their real origins, while creating emotional bonds to Constance and the Lowell legacy that would ensure their lifelong loyalty and dedication. Agent Hoffman's investigation revealed that several of the children had died during the experimental procedures conducted prior to their arrival at the mansion. The memory erasure process was dangerous and unpredictable, and not all subjects were able to survive the psychological trauma involved in completely reconstructing their identities. The children who had survived were those who possessed unusual psychological resilience or who had responded particularly well to the conditioning techniques. The legal case against Constance Lowell and her associates involved charges that included kidnapping, child endangerment, conspiracy to commit fraud, and conducting illegal medical experiments. However, the complexity of the crimes and the wealth and influence of those involved made prosecution extremely challenging. Constance's legal team argued that she had been attempting to help traumatized children recover from legitimate psychological damage, and that her methods, while unconventional, were motivated by genuine concern for their welfare. The 13 children who were rescued from the Lowell mansion faced an extraordinarily difficult process of recovery and rehabilitation. The psychological conditioning they had undergone had been so thorough that many had no desire to recover their original identities, even when presented with evidence of their real names and family backgrounds. They had become psychologically dependent on the artificial personalities that had been constructed for them, and attempts to restore their original memories often resulted in severe psychological distress. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, a specialist in cult deprogramming and psychological recovery, led the team responsible for helping the children rebuild their lives after their rescue. Her work revealed that the memory erasure process had been only partially successful in most cases, leaving fragments of original personality and memory that could sometimes be recovered through careful therapeutic intervention. The process of identifying the children and reconnecting them with their original families proved to be almost as traumatic as their initial conditioning. Many of the children had been reported missing years earlier, and their families had long since given up hope of finding them alive. The psychological changes that the children had undergone made it difficult for family members to recognize them, and the children themselves often showed no interest in re-establishing relationships with people they could not remember. Some of the children were eventually able to recover portions of their original identities and rebuild relationships with their biological families. However, others remained permanently damaged by their experiences, unable to function outside the controlled environment that Constance had created for them. Several required long-term institutional care, while others struggled with identity disorders and psychological problems that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The investigation into the Lowell case revealed connections to other similar experiments that had been conducted by wealthy individuals and organizations interested in pushing the boundaries of psychological research and social control. The case became a landmark example of how financial resources could be used to exploit vulnerable populations and conduct research that violated every principle of medical ethics and human rights. Constance Lowell herself was eventually convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to life in prison, though she continued to maintain that her actions had been motivated by genuine love for the children and a desire to provide them with opportunities that they could never have achieved in their original circumstances. Her conviction marked the end of one of the most disturbing cases of psychological abuse and exploitation in American legal history. The Lowell mansion was eventually sold and converted into a research center focused on the study of memory, identity, and psychological recovery. The facility was dedicated to developing ethical methods for helping victims of psychological abuse and exploitation, ensuring that the knowledge gained from studying the Lowell case would be used to prevent similar tragedies in the future. 13 children who survived Constance Lowell's experiment became living testimony to both the resilience of the human spirit and the devastating effects of systematic psychological abuse. Their experiences contributed to important advances in understanding how memory and identity function, while also highlighting the importance of protecting vulnerable individuals from those who would exploit them for personal gain or scientific curiosity. The macabre history of the Lowell family serves as a reminder that wealth and social position can be used not only to acquire material goods, but also to purchase the silence and cooperation necessary to commit the most heinous crimes against the innocent. The case continues to influence discussions about research ethics, child protection, and the responsibility of society to prevent the exploitation of those who cannot protect themselves. The legacy of the 13 nameless children extends beyond their individual stories to encompass broader questions about the nature of identity, the malleability of human personality, and the ethical boundaries that must govern all attempts to understand and manipulate human consciousness. Their suffering was not in vain if it serves to prevent others from experiencing similar horrors, and reminds us that some knowledge is too dangerous to pursue, regardless of the scientific insights it might provide. Thank you for watching another tale unfold here on NW Storytime. Every story hides a secret, and tonight you uncovered another one. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us keep the secrets alive. Until next time, stay curious,